welcome to Temple Bar, for those of you who haven't been here before. Hope you enjoy the evening. And so this evening we're really excited to have a panel discussion about sort of the next gen of architecture, some early career thoughts. And so this evening we're going to hear from Jalal, who's a Part 2 assistant at Fatkin, working in the transport and infrastructure sector. From Stephanie, who trained in New York, has practiced in Hong Kong, London and New York, and is currently at Child Graden Lewis, and has had work featured in Vogue and the RA. And if I swap around, from James, who's a recently graduated Part 2 from the London School of Architecture, who's set up the petition some of you may be aware of, sort of to the government to consider protection of function for architects. And Rishi, who's an architect at HOK, currently working on a school in Nigeria.
Hi guys. So when I was writing this, I tried to phrase the question that I wanted to ask myself optimistically rather than pessimistically. But I'll clarify as I go on. But I asked myself, how can we help students be more assured during and after their architectural education? It sounds a little subjective. When I say assured, I mean in a more neutral way, in a sense that it's not about whether you choose to have an architectural career or not after uni, but simply giving them at least the tools to feel confident in that decision. And just as a preface, I'll put aside some of the crazy political economic stuff going on and just assume that we get through the education and worry about the sort of other issues that come after that when we need to. But if I just dive in, I've written this in quite full prose, so apologies if I do read sort of hefty bits of text, but here we go. So, and also some of these things might seem a little elementary, but I just wanted to sort of address them because I feel like some of these points may not be spoken about as much as I think we should. So first point would be, I would actually encourage Art Foundation incredibly heavily, more from a perspective of enabling students to get an initial feel for the process of designing. It can be difficult to dedicate enough mental resources when balancing high school subjects. And at least in a foundation, you can start to familiarise yourself with the reflective process that you need to really get into a design process. And a student can explore other fields of design and creativity, and that can only really add to and enrich the experience that they have going through whether they do architecture after that or not. And yeah, many students from architecture courses move into other creative fields after graduating as well. But I think a setup where in an art foundation you can explore other creative fields is incredibly valuable, and it's free to do before you're 19, so do it. Number two, I'm going to say work placements should be integrated into, and this might be controversial, but I'll say it, all undergraduate degrees or courses for architecture. I was a student rep at Central St. Martin's and at the LSA, but when I was especially at CSM, I consistently hear that students felt underprepared for the reality of work in the industry, and despite having professional studies modules, that was still the prevailing sentiment. And this feeling was unrelated to being talented or a good designer. It was effectively about how students felt there was a gap in their knowledge about business management, business practice, simply in a way that they felt that having a better understanding of that would help them slot in a lot better and understand what's going on around them in their first practice experience and feel a lot less alienated when transitioning into the workplace. Also, the rigidity, I'll say this as well, the rigidity of hierarchies and practices is often first understood through that first graduate job, through exposure. And these hierarchies are valid ways to organise and run a business successfully, and it's important that graduates have at least discussed the theory on how to adapt to these structures and critique them where necessary as well. I guess, I'm trying to say that there's no proxy for working in practice, but it's crucial to have a space where you can reflect on that and critique that as necessary, especially when you're first moving into the industry, I think. I'll slow down a little bit. Number three, I'm going to say this, it kind of leads on from the second point, really. Teach students to be critical and discerning about the nature of leadership, vision, and hierarchy in the industry. This sort of romanticized idea of the design process and the visionary architect is a very strong image in popular media, further reinforced by this notion of the enlightened designer. We like to say star architect, all these things, right? We know what this means here, but the critiques, and we know the critiques associated with that concept as well, but there's still something seductive about the idea, which is fine, and it's good to strive to be visionary and to be have a dedicated attitude towards things. But it's important that we gives students the tools to critique this approach, I think, because healthy introspection around what motivates somebody to be an architect or a designer is crucial, and you can sort of then start to pick out whether you're doing things for kind of an orienting reason outside of yourself, or whether you're doing it because you have to prove something, I think. And I think popular media and architecture PR of the 20th century fails to emphasize one thing enough, and that's effective collaborative working is what yields architectural designs, practices, and careers that all have longevity. So it's sort of, that's the reason why I think we should have that conversation. You know, the collaborative aspect is super important. Point 4, and it sort of leads on again, interdisciplinary collaborative projects need to be a core part of architectural curriculums. If it's possible to have a collaborative project with another subject at the same uni, or even students at different universities, I think it should happen. And there's huge potential for innovation, but also the development of soft skills required to effectively collaborate across disciplines as you would after you graduate. And I think this really needs to be emphasized a lot more, and it will help develop the skill of young architectural professionals speaking about architecture to non-architecture people as well. And further from that as well, I think it would help each university further develop sort of their own flavour of architecture graduate in a much more distinct way. We have certain universities that have more integrated approach to collaboration across disciplines within their course, but not every uni does this. If I give a quick example, like I went to Central St Martin's for undergrad, and they have an amazing material futures course for masters. I would have loved to collaborate with that in a more structured way through my undergrad, because there were so many amazing ideas. I keep seeing in degree shows, like, I need to work with these guys, and I'd hang out with them and everything. But if it's not structured in the right way, then people kind of let that fall by the wayside, you know. Point number 5. When new educational institutions are created to deliver innovative and exciting architecture courses with different sort of flavours of pedagogy, I think they need to have an equal focus on providing proper access to resources in Standard 5 of the ARB Accreditation Handbook. I'll quote this a little bit. Currently states that institutions will normally provide evidence of such resources, and there's no minimum requirement set by ARB for those resources. I believe this should be stricter, so that when an institution focuses heavily on a new form of pedagogy, it does not overlook the infrastructure that an architecture student will always need. Trying to avoid provision of access to things like workshop space by financially compensating students with a resources budget, I think is insufficient, and yet has happened on courses before. In the same vein, I'll also say that a healthy yearly materials budget must be part of what students have as workshop access. I'll leave that where that is. Point 6, I'll say it's a cultural point. Students must be encouraged to participate in the life of the city or the town in which they study, and then be encouraged to travel to all sorts of places around the world as part of their education. If they can't afford the travels and trips included in the course, I think discrete financial assistance needs to be widely available for these people. I've seen a lot of socioeconomically working class students get priced out of having these opportunities at uni. And I plainly think that given the cost of education at the moment, it's not fair that some students find themselves in that predicament, because there's so much enrichment, and I would argue there's a lot more breadth to be added to somebody's character beyond the curriculum by ensuring that they can do these things alongside their peers. And then, here we go. Point number 7, and I think this is my final point. Possible career pathways after an undergraduate and postgraduate architecture qualification, I think, need to be more actively discussed with students, especially whilst they're on the course. Again, when I was at St Martin's, I remember one of the first things that we were asked when we had our first sort of contextual studies lecture is, how many of you want to be architects? And literally less than half the room put their hand up. Jerry will remember, you'll remember that moment, right? I was at uni with Jerry. And we all looked around, and that was incredibly surprising. But as we went through the course, we realised why that was. And we can sort of all feel it now that a lot of us have gone through it. There's a lot of transferable skills that you can get from having gone through a course like this. And I think a more like frank discussion around how you don't have to feel like you have to be an architect just because you did an architecture course. I think it's really important, and it will also give a lot more students a sort of a bit more hope if they don't gel with it. the sort of thing of determining your career by what you study is slightly less relevant now. And I think having the support for students to discuss that, I think would be very beneficial. Try and kind of summarize. I mean, these sorts of topics sort of stem from my time as student rep on both masters and undergrad. And despite other topics like wage transparency, unionization, regenerative design, politicization of education, or even sort of maybe the conversation about restructuring architecture courses to allow for elective modules in other areas as students may be interested in. Those are all really worthy topics. I haven't got enough time to talk about it. But I think the sort of core baseline points that I've tried to cover cover like at least 80 to 85% of the core architectural experience of why you go to uni to initially study architecture. And I just want people to feel more hopeful, more assured, and the spaces for these conversations that I've kind of touched on to happen more generally within that. So, yeah, that's my sort of case.
I'm Stephanie, and I work at Child Grad and Lewis. I guess I've been thinking a lot about flight risk. As a woman who immigrated to the UK 5 years ago under the BNO scheme, and with parents who've also moved multiple countries around the world, I guess flight risk can come out in different forms, whether it is to stay in your hometown and come to London, whether it is to stay in an industry that you studied in and pivot. All of these can take different forms. And I guess also at an age where many of my friends are getting married, it feels both very exciting and slightly loaded, especially as a woman, when personal timing and professional career progression seem to collide so unfairly. This is why I find the conversation around protection of function really important. My worry is that architecture will respond to its fragmentation by tightening itself further and adding bureaucracy in a way that makes our profession feel smaller. Competence, accountability, and public safety absolutely matter, but the question is how we protect them without reducing our breadth of increasing architectural work. I think there's history here. The RIBA was founded in 1834 and granted its royal charter in 1837, with early concerns around fees, practice, and conduct. Registration followed in 1931, and protection of the word architect was strengthened in 1938, followed by the Section 20 of the Architects Act of 1997. It's still the title that's protected, rather than the full function of our work. We've also lost some of the shared structures that once helped describe our professional value. After roughly a century of mandatory minimum fee scales, the RIBA was required to drop them in 1982, and 10 years later, the recommended indicative scales that followed were also withdrawn. Meanwhile, procurement has fragmented those responsibilities even further. That is why I find Chris Williamson's argument for protection of function really, really important. My anxiety is not with the principle, but with the method of how our competence is defined, how much bureaucracy is created, and whether the process strengthens our architectural judgment or simply adds admin time. I say all of this as someone who still finds our work genuinely really fulfilling, and in many ways more interesting the longer I stay in it. I'm also currently working towards licensure following relocating around the world 2 times. So I promise I'm not just saying this in the presence of my extremely supportive colleagues, let alone my big boss, Simon Child at Child Grad and Lewis. My own relationship with architecture has never been entirely traditional. As a teenager, I had the opportunity to apprentice with a stringed instrument maker. Every day after school for about a year, I started working at his workshop, starting with sharpening chisels and sweeping the floor, to eventually building and designing an electric cello. That simple joy of making something real with your hands was what really drew me in. But I was also drawn to the breadth. You can never get bored in our field, as you know. It's what attracted me to go study at Cornell University in the US. I liked that the curriculum encouraged a cross-disciplinary approach and a lot of balance, albeit sometimes too much balance, given that PE was still a university requirement across the 5 years. My first placement was in Hong Kong, and I found it difficult to admit to my friends how much I disliked that internship. I think I had some growing up to do. I was helping a lot with competitions, and I found the late nights of photoshopping, and let alone learning how to use Photoshop, learning how to use SketchUp, really disheartening because I felt like I lost all sense of freedom and all sense of agency. So the following year, I did the complete opposite and I applied to work with ex-National Geographic explorers in the Tibetan border. I loved speaking with villagers and documenting their homes at a moment of increasing political pressure. And that to me felt a lot more human and a lot closer to the architecture I had imagined. Later, when I had to think more seriously about my career and to make things work financially, my very strict single mother quite rightly told me to grow up and find a way of dialing down this idealism in a way that could pay the bills. I later went on to complete an MA in interior design at the Royal College of Art, and in between and throughout, I've worked across interiors, architecture, and illustration in New York, California, and London. I still found parts of the work quite tiring and tedious, I have to admit, but I think something mentally shifted inside. First, I had to pay the bills, and so you kind of suck it up a bit, but I also get to see that I get to draw, think, and design, and contribute to spaces that genuinely makes people's lives so much better, and get to do that for a living. I also accepted that every job has its less glamorous parts and that the work becomes genuinely more fulfilling and a lot more people-facing when you see the bigger picture and when you become a lot more skilled. In some ways, I also feel that adjacent roles to our profession can feel closer to the romance of architecture that we were taught at university. They often sit nearer to bigger questions of how communities are affected, how projects are funded, and how cities change. And I do not say this with the door closed. I'm very curious about those in the audience who've had far more interesting and illustrious careers, including pivots into adjacent fields. What led you there? What changed? What were you like? What was going through your mind, and what did that thought process feel like for you? For women, that signal can also feel particularly sharp. RIBA's 2025 report with the Fawcett Society, following on from a 2003 study, says that many of the same issues remain more than 20 years later, including unequal pay, barriers to progression, long hours culture, presenteeism, and workplace cultures that penalize caring responsibilities. The talent pipeline exists, but the harder question is what happens along the way and whether our profession and our offices are structured in a way that incentivizes talented women to stay and remain in. That's why for me, protection of function cannot just be about protecting our territory. Certain responsibilities have to sit with competent and accountable professionals, but if the profession becomes too defensive about its boundaries, we risk missing the bigger opportunity to showcase to the world why our architectural training and judgment, now more so than ever, has a huge impact in practice, policy, development, sustainability, and delivery. Thank you.
I'm going to start by, I think, just touching on the subject of the Starchitect. I think, as you can see, most of these people are dead. And I think so is the idea of the Starchitect, really, in our career. That isn't Peter Murray, by the way. That's... But I just want to talk about kind of our role within the wider construction and design profession. So this is data from Google that pulls from all scholarly and internet articles, archives available. And you can see the title of architect is a relatively new development, in terms of its popularity, only really gaining traction through the 1800s and then into the 1900s. But you can see it's actually now dropped below mentions of designer, and it's kind of approaching the level of builder. So really, where does the architect sit within the profession? Is it a profession or is it a vocation? That's kind of what I'd like to understand. And throughout this, this is a diagram from the web of blame that was created after the Grenfell tragedy. And where does the architect sit within this? We adopt so much liability and responsibility, and yet we're granted so little of the reward of a project. And at the same time, we're actually not given that much control over what's put into the buildings. And this is partly to do with insurance. So professional indemnity is really important. You can tell this is a little outdated because the Wren's still on it. But when we see developments through the Building Safety Act, like principal designer roles and principal contractor roles, we're actually being actively encouraged not to take on this responsibility, which I I don't know, I find kind of interesting as an early career professional because if we don't have responsibility over the buildings, why are we calling ourselves architects? And this links to the original mandate of RIBA. So at no point in RIBA's founding mandate does it actually mention that architects design buildings, which I thought was kind of incredible. We advance architecture, but the question of what is architecture and what is an architect is kind of still left open for interpretation. And so I feel like we're at this really exciting stage where we can actually start to define this. And so I wanted to try and bring some momentum to the movement through protecting the function. I think graduating from a university in the UK, when we have all of these mutual recognition agreements, you know, why stay in the UK as a young architect when you can move to Germany or other countries that actually recognise the function of an architect in law? I don't think it makes sense, and we're not on par with our kind of competitors. And I see it kind of as a link to citizens' initiatives within the EU. I think it's something the UK doesn't have, but it's really useful that if 1 million EU citizens vote for something, then that actually becomes law. I think by protecting the function of the architect, all of a sudden that's 80,000 people just in the UK who can actually begin to just decide the future of the profession and kind of begin to regulate the built environment, begin to lobby, which is something I think we've been kind of let down by so far. So this is where we're at. It'd be really great to get a response, and if your practice is in an area on this grey map, or is in a grey area on this map, then you'll probably get a call from me in the next month or so, asking you to sign. But yeah, and that's the link. I'd be really grateful if anyone who hasn't signed already to just scan the QR code and at least get it open on a tab for you to fill in later. But yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
So my name is Rishi Lal. I'm an architect at HRK. We're just 20-minute tube in that direction. Pay us a visit if you like. And I'm 5 years into my 10-year journey, or the 10-year journey, which is what I want to talk about this evening. So the first 10 years of practice and why they're so important, why they need to be focused on in light of what, you know, the great things that Jalal, Stephanie and James talked about in terms of the future of the profession. Because it's really in those 10 years that you start to foster the direction of what you want to pursue in architecture. And I can see there's some really well-seasoned architects in the audience today, and I'm sure you agree that even if your direction changes post those 10 years, it's really in that first decade that you define to yourself and to others what the profession means to you. So that's the gist of what I'm going to talk about today. And I guess my thesis for the topic broadly is ownership. And what is ownership in this case? Ownership is making decisions, influencing vision, and what does architecture mean to you? I think that's the main thing. So what have you decided that architecture means to you? And how does that fit into the grander landscape of how you perceive the industry? Sorry, I'm just like my font's really small here. It doesn't have to be consistent with everyone else, but it does have to be coherent, because when it's coherent, then you can attach it to a function that the architect uniquely delivers. So you finish your part 3, great. You're back in practice and you find that you're doing the same thing that you're doing before. As Jalal mentioned, you know, you're still focused on coordination, you're still focused on fee pressures and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think the issue is if you train young architects to just put that at the forefront of their focus, then you're training young architects into an aspect of passivity. So I think it's important to avoid that and to really explore the architect's agency from an early age. So, and that isn't a cynical or cliche mode of thinking. I think it's the feeling of deficiency of agency which creates our most creative buildings, makes our most sort of creative spaces. And I think the danger isn't just people leaving the profession, it's young architects staying in the profession, but losing confidence in their ability to influence it and change it. So, I've given this a bit of thought, and I've come with 3 things that architects within the first 10 years of their profession should focus on. So it's 3 ingredients. Equally weighed, like Yorkshire puddings. That's probably the most British thing I've ever said in a public talk. I'll try and say that in the States and see how that lands. Oh, and there we go. I said I wasn't going to talk about food, and there we go. Right. But the 3 things. So the first thing is being present. So being in the physical space. The online space is great, but as you probably agree, there's a lot of racket. So just being present in a space, seeing what people are saying on site, what their concerns are, what's working well, what a committee's talking about, what they're whispering about property conventions, what does your neighbour think about, how they inhabit space, what are they saying at Temple Bar, visit Temple Bar, templebar.london. I wasn't asked to say that, but why not throw in a plug there. And the second one is inquiry. So I think inquiry is really important today because with the advent of ChatGPT, fast format media, knowledge isn't as impressive as it once was. So if schools are moving towards inquiry-based learning, then why aren't we? And universities will eventually catch up, but it's not something that we can wait on. So that's the second point. And the third point, the last point is, and this might sound similar to the first point, but it's an important distinction, which is worth emphasizing, and that's networking beyond architecture. So if we truly are a interdisciplinary profession, then what are solicitors saying about us? What are solicitors saying in general? What are accountants talking about? We can't be insulated as a profession. I think that's important to understand. And to close, I've learned it's important to say close because then people are hopeful that you're going to have drinks soon, and I'm sure you've heard quite enough for tonight. And this relates to the broader discussion of today. If we want to protect something, our first instinct is to insulate it. But I think insulating something incidentally stops it from acclimatizing. And I spoke to an ex-Marine fairly recently while exercising ingredient 3. He's now a school governor after sort of leaving the military. And he came up with a really interesting thing he always told himself when he was navigating his profession. And bear in mind, this is a military institution that he was in. And he'd always say to himself, you'll dislike change, but you'll dislike irrelevance even more. And I think that's a fantastic thing to understand when navigating the future of this profession. So, and I think the first 10 years, just to sum that up, is where you'll either build that confidence or relevance, or you'll quietly let it slip away. Thank you.
I think we can all agree there were some really interesting thoughts there. So we're going to take a few questions whilst you all have a think about what you would like to ask. I've got a quick question for James. You said that the RIBA hadn't defined architect and we could now. Do you have a pet definition you would like to see?
No, I don't. But I will say, and I think I agree with Rishi's point on networking outside of just architecture, but also I think insulation, because I think when you hear protection of function, that does sound like insulating. And I've had a lot of long conversations with Chris Williamson about this issue. And I think maybe the answer is to look at competency across the built environment to avoid pissing off a lot of people who aren't. Because there's lots of people who do the role of the architect very well, much better than any of us ever will, who aren't architects. And that's just the reality of the situation. And I think having some kind of competency-based regulation is definitely the way forward. That being said, within a competency-based framework, it's still really important that we know what an architect does. And I think we can start with existing policy. I think we can look at building control and whether there are things that an architect must do within building control. Because I don't think, design obviously can't just be limited to architects. There's lots of good designers. And I also think within the planning framework, it's really important to have an architect involved. And I know that there's lots of projects that architects might walk away from because of contentions with planning or other things. Equally, there's projects that clients probably aren't too willing to do. So yeah, hopefully that's a good enough answer, even though there's no definition as of yet.
I wanted to ask, sort of probably to all of you really, whoever wants to answer, but to what extent are you, this is probably swearing in a way, but to what extent are you engaging with AI? And does that concern you, looking at it more seriously, to the point where I'm understanding the cost of different agents and making decisions based on that. So it becomes quite a commercial decision, not just, typing something into ChatGPT or Copilot or something like that. But are you experiencing that, and have you thought about how that might affect your careers? Because it will affect it more than mine, fundamentally. And if so, is there anything that you are doing about that?
I am using it as a leverage. Sorry for completely going for it, but I use AI on a daily basis as a way of leveraging my productivity. So that means using Gemini to create visuals really quickly and options for clients. So in a way, saving on that, but in a way, it still doesn't cut down on that time because now the clients expect more. But it's just a way of testing ideas as well. So writing from the perspective of the perspective of a planning officer and just thinking more critically and widely. But I think in terms of AI, the thing that I am concerned about is how it affects early career architects entering our profession, especially part ones. I think there was recently an article published by the AJ on how there were 2,600 applications for a spot at JTP Architects. And I think firms need to know that, yes, you can save on some cost and productivity from your staff members, but in order to keep our profession sustainable, we need to train the next generation. But to hire for, I think your early point about knowledge, hire for curiosity and hire for the interest and being proactive to seek out more information and doing that quickly with AI. So I think very positively about it. I might be being too optimistic. I don't know if the others have things to say about it.
I might have a strange technical point on it. I think when I look at developments in AI, I'm only really going to start to maybe share the same worry as you when we have literal humanoid robots who can stand in a room and ask themselves the same questions that we can. I think until then, you're effectively hallucinating and generating designs from something that's consumed everything that's come before and has just created something of a recognizable pattern in that vein. It's not a verifiably good design. And I think, woe unto thee who uses it to do that, really. But until then, I don't share the same worry. And even at that point, you have to think, it's very philosophical, but existentially, these entities that have that ability in these bodies that may come within our lifetime, they're not going to design in the same way we are. They're not going to design for the same constraints of their existence either. And gets very, architectural philosophy kind of conversation. But I think there's going to be far less overlap than we realize. But I really appreciate your point on leveraging productivity. I think that's the most powerful thing. And then again, I would agree with your later one about pulling the ladder up, so to speak. That's, I feel, more pertinent than the designing aspect of architecture, I think.
I can speak a little bit to the student experience, having just gone through it at part 2. A lot of people have said that they use AI in their university studies in Design Studio because it's a lot like having a little part 1 to do work for you. And I think, on your point, it's really crucial that we don't forget that AI, as Jalal says, is just hallucinating the entire world's knowledge of design to create something for you. And I think it's very good at doing things quickly, and I'm sure there are lots of applications that will come through that it's really good at, especially in architecture. But I think, interestingly, what I've seen is a resurgence in hand practices to kind of convey your design thesis. So there's been a lot more hand drawing than I've seen in the past. We drew like one-to-one building details. We drew axonometrics of our kind of final projects as a kind of a way to differentiate ourselves from the students who are just putting into ChatGPT and make an AXO of this. I don't know where the value lies, to be honest, at the moment, but I see a future where maybe there are some clients, maybe more wealthy clients, who actually will pay for the human touch. I don't know. I'd love to know thoughts in the room. But yeah, I also see a dystopian universe where maybe the role of the architect and the function of the architect is just watching a server farm do all the work. I don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. And I sort of wonder if when you had the advent of Revit and AutoCAD, was there that same scare and concern? And I suppose there was, but I think the difference with AI is just how fast it is and how, quickly it can generate certain things that can help your workflow. And I mean, as an architect, that's brilliant for me because then you can get things done quicker, you can explore options quicker. The difficulty is that obviously the job market is undoubtedly a bit strained for part ones that are trying to get onto the, sort of start their careers. I don't see it as something that's going to supersede the architect because ultimately with AI and anything that's generated, you need someone to validate it. So once an image is created, if we're taking that example, then you as a person has to validate it. And until you've got a mechanism to replace that, then I don't think there's anything to necessarily be too scared about. But then again, I think the other sort of leg of that is me personally working on specific projects I won't mention now. Otherwise you all can't leave the room. But with them, there's an actual sort of prohibition against using AI because you're putting data into that system. So if there's more projects that follow that workflow, it'll be interesting to see a lot of students that have been reliant on AI during university come into practice working on sort of protected, secure projects, having to just result back into the autonomous ways of drawing. So I'd always encourage students at university to always keep in touch with their drawing skills outside of AI, but at the same time explore what you can do with it because if you can use it, it helps you in practice.
Still on the topic of AI. Well, no, as someone that's severe dyspraxic and dysgraphic, with my hand-to-eye coordination, drawing a one-to, hand drawing, it's an absolute nightmare. So, with a little AI touch-up, it goes a long way. But would you say with the whole sort of attitude towards AI within the industry, you think that it's more sort of European and British sort of arrogance towards it, or as opposed to sort of embracing a technology like what the Americans, when it comes to technology in general, the Americans are the first to embrace it. Chinese, Japanese, and now India as well, and the Middle East as well. Would you say that it's more of a cultural attitude? Or that we sort of have to get over it and accept that it's here to stay, but we should not dictate, but sort of we shouldn't let it overtake the industry, but we should kind of use it as a tool, essentially, similar to what CAD has been, for God knows how many years. What do you guys think on that? It's open.
I'd like to compare it to photography in the 1920s, because I think for painters, or like the loom, for example, like for painters and for people who stitched by hand, the invention of the loom, the invention of the camera must have seemed like the end of the world. But we still have painters, we still have people who hand weave. I think maybe there is, only because I'm interested in this, I think there might be a case for the resurgence of kind of the architect craft person as opposed to the architect professional, because I do think AI is really good at the professional side of the job, and I think it's less good at the design and craft side.
Like you said, it's a tool. I think it's a tool, and I think there are far more qualified people to talk about technology and AI and all that. But I think from a perspective of just sort of early to mid-level career professional, it's like you want to produce high quality work for your managers and for your clients in a really good setting, and it's just another way of doing that. And I think, like you said, the human touch is almost, you can capitalize on that even more. And Ash here is an incredible hand illustrator, and I'm sure during drinks he could talk about how the resurgence and just increasing demand for proper hand drawing, and all of this is just a skill. But like you said in your speech, it's about not wanting to fall behind and wanting to remain relevant in the field, and it's one of the skills that you just must must learn, I think.
Can I respond to that just really quickly, just to add to that? Sorry, guys. I've kind of been thrown. No, actually, just ask the questions. Just ask the questions.
Oh, go ahead, gentleman in the waistcoat.
Hi. Talking about protecting the function, going through part 3 at the moment of Jalal, there was a question raised about why you're doing this beyond the natural career progression, but the things that qualifying brings in terms of burdens and responsibility. So I thought it was really interesting to think about that, where in a world where increasingly we have architectural designers that never qualify but hold the same career progression, I guess. So what, to you, what benefits and why is qualification to hold the title promoted?
Sure. Well, caveat to this, I haven't qualified yet. But I am planning on doing part 3. I think it's a question of agency and where you see yourself in the industry. Because I think architectural designers, for the most part, have a really amazing skill set. But in terms of agency over a project, for example, in a design and build contract, an architectural designer will always be undermined by the contractor. And I think in terms of final design quality, having an architect who has the knowledge that you gain in part 3 of ARB code of conduct, but also building regulations that you gain through experience, I think that's really critical. Yeah, I'd love to know why you're doing part 3.
Well, the question threw me. So, I was like, it just feels like the natural progression. You've been doing it for 10 years. It's sort of the next thing to do. And then, like at the moment, learning about all of those responsibilities, liabilities, almost burdens that come with qualifying. I thought it was an interesting take to be like, why choose that harder route, I guess, where you can just stay not qualified and.
But you could get your part 3 and not register.
Yeah. You could also do that.
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, not to get too depressing.
I mean, like Chris Mullins.
That's a terrible place to drop out at the end of part 3.
Yeah.
I think maybe it goes back to the human touch then, because I'm not trying to say that protection of title is meaningless. I think it still has sway, maybe more so within the industry than without at the moment. But I think it's still important from a company's perspective to be able to call yourself an architect. And I think for bigger clients, it's still a requirement for them when looking for people to do work that they are hiring an architect. I think it's maybe rare with bigger clients that you have an architectural designer as opposed to an architect. I mean, and this is a bit of a tangent, but going back to the first slide and the idea of like losing this idea of the starchitect, maybe the function of the architect is actually a studio. It's not a single person. So maybe within that you have designers and people who do a more traditional architect role. I know Fatkin, where I previously worked, were looking at hiring a principal designer in-house. I know a lot of other people are doing that with this new BRPD regulation. But maybe that's the answer. Maybe we aren't architects until we work for an architect studio. Hopefully that gives you a bit less pessimism. But
this was an interesting point to raise with, as I say, all of the responsibilities and liabilities that come with qualifying when there is a sort of non-qualification route that might give you the same outcome without the pain, I guess.
You intend to finish your part 3?
Yeah.
Great. That's now
I was going to say, any thoughts from Stephanie and Rishi, because you are both architects, so you must have made the decision.
Well, I'm qualifying, so
Another
it's a situation where, so it's coming from the American route. There is a mutually recognized agreement between the US and the UK, and so getting it from an American and different perspective, it's very fascinating to see what's covered in the Part 3 versus the NCARB route of qualification. So I'm always very amazed at how the Part 3 route really forces you to reflect and to think and be honest about, and the human touch of having a Viva and all of that versus the American approach of the computerized exams and technical memorization and all of that. So I see benefits of both, but both countries recognize each other, and it's really good that we are in a very globally recognized system. Like we can practice in Australia and Canada and all that. So there's a lot of merit to that.
I would always encourage people to finish part 3, and I'm not being paid to say that at all. And it is just, there's a lot of criticism you can have about, education in architecture here, but there is a lot of rigor when it comes to part 3. And it's back to the discussion that if people start to recede away from part 3 thinking there's a lot of responsibility you're taking on, then ultimately that vacuum is going to be filled by another profession. And okay, there's probably nothing wrong with that, but then the architect, I think, is best positioned to complete that journey and to take that on. So what I'm trying to say is that, architect, it's definitely worth pursuing architecture, even if it is just at the moment for the sake of saying, I'm an architect legally. But there's so many different threads to qualifying, and someone mentioned the mutual recognition agreement as well earlier. And if you have aspirations in working abroad in different countries, then that is one of the sort of main things you need to have in order to transition into different professions. Which for me, I think is just worth it for that.
I think I have to admit, I might be the only person here that wanted to leave the profession many times. And I've studied an interior design degree. I've worked in interiors, I really loved that. I've worked in illustration, I also really loved that. I worked in Tibet. And I think that chaotic, I'm just maybe not as structured as everyone else in the room, but coming back to architecture, and I've interviewed at multiple project management companies, and I needed to be in those interview rooms and get those job offers and realize at my own pace and my own terms that I actually really like the built environment, and I really want to come back. And that gave me a lot more rigor, but I'm really grateful that I gave myself the time to do that exploring. Yes, I might be a bit older, but I'm really grateful for my life experiences, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. So anyone who has a slightly non-traditional path, I suggest you give that a go if given the chance. Yeah.
I think quickly, I will say something this time. The question that James raised around competency being part of the key way of defining what an architect as a role can be. There's sort of this question then when you do your Rishi moment of 10-year journey, after you then ask yourself the question as James, you're like, what am I prepared to be liable for as well? Do I feel like I have, if you can question that and sort of question your own expertise in that realm, just plainly as a designer, but also there are a lot of cases. There are cases that happen in our industry that could provide us the sort of the information to sift through to figure that out for ourselves in the industry. I would be really interested for a next event if we could do a mock jury for the Grenfell case. And if we can just explore it, not necessarily blame anybody in particular, but for our own understanding, that web you put up, let's talk through it. Let's talk through what the judge thought. Let's talk through what was presented from the claimants and everything like that. There's going to be something there that might stand out to all of us in this room that is worth lingering on. But until we do that on these really kind of real world scenarios, we might never truly figure it out. I think we should do that.
Speaking about flight risk, because I feel like quite a few people spoke about architectural education and how maybe there's a romanticism there that is not quite achieved when you reach actual practice, and that is maybe related to oversubscribed Part 1 jobs alongside the AI issue and the fact that maybe part of their function in practice is being taken over by technology. But yeah, do you think there's a mismatch between kind of what's being advertised and what you're actually getting, and should that be more aligned and possibly our reputation be aligned with what our actual jobs are? And then also I was quite interested in the female side. Well, Steph, you touched on that, but how that more adversely affects women in the profession. Could you all speak on that?
first on your on two things. The first one, like just from the perspective of the misalignment of the role. I think all of us can speak to friends that have absolutely no idea what we're doing, or what they think they know what we're doing, but not. It's completely misaligned with what we actually do. But I do think it's really hard to package all of that into into a part one and part two degree, frankly. So I think I agree. Like I agree with you. Like there needs to be work placements throughout university so that like students are better prepared for just the realities of the maturity of entering a job. And just having to check emails and the etiquette involved and showing up and all of that I think relates. But I agree. I think there needs to be more exposure to just more practices generally around the world. This is not unique to the UK. And secondly, obviously, I can't give a blanket speech about women, but I do see, you know, and the fact, like one of the reasons why I was drawn to working at Child Grad and Lewis is that it's one of the few firms that it's 60% women, and there are it's very diverse compared to the average architectural firm, and I wanted to be able to model after women in leadership, frankly. Not saying that you can't model that after men, but it's easier when you can talk to your manager about being the only person of color in a room of men, and how sometimes you can feel like you don't belong. And having sort of more honest conversations with people like that in your office, I think really helps when you're starting out. So I don't know. I'm sort of looking at that space, and there are, you know, pregnant people in the office, and just you know, you do think about how it's going to affect your career, and I worry it's negative.
Yeah, just on I don't know if this answers your question, but you only mentioned about you know representation of practice in university. I think that's a big one because there's an incredible variety of different flavors of practice. And I know when I was at university, it was just divided into big practices and small practices. And you knew if you go into a big practice, you're just doing CAD. Apparently, if you're in a small practice, they just give you everything and just go home and drink tea. But it's only when you actually get into practice you notice that within big practices, there's loads of different, you know, flavors of you might be doing. You might have more responsibility than you sort of thought when you're at university. And likewise, a small practice might be different. So I think it's worth in universities expressing that variety that you get in different practices before you leave. Because I think, just from my perspective, that can turn a lot of people off if you think there's just these two options when you leave university. And I want to go for a big practice, but I don't want to be doing that, or you know, yeah. Sorry if that.
No,
so,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's good. Just building. I'd be interested to hear other people on the panel's ideas on specifically like flight risk from underrepresented groups in architecture. If you have thoughts, I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but obviously just asking Steph to speak on that is possibly not.
I think she gave great.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll speak to it briefly. I think I'll speak about my own experience because I can't really talk about anything else. But I think it's so important to be exposed to industry really early, and at no point in my educational journey has it been possible for me to not work at the same time as study. So I think that's a really important thing. And actually, coming to the end of it and looking back on the last 6 years it's been since I started part one, that's been really valuable because I've been able, luckily, to work in architecture practices a lot of that time. That also isn't for everyone. Lots of people aren't able to work on a part one salary and still study. I think exposure to the industry is the most important thing. I think it's such a shame that we've lost the apprenticeship route because there were so many people who I was talking to where I would tell them, don't do a part one, go and do the apprenticeship because it's the same length of time and you work the whole time. So you know straight away, within the first 3 months, you'll know if real architecture is for you or not. I also think maybe flight risk from the degree maybe is just a symptom of the fact that it's so disconnected. But I don't know whether the answer to that is to fix the education to be less kind of diverse, because I actually think even if you don't go on to do architecture, it's still a really valuable degree. Like, it teaches you a lot of, you know, multidisciplinary skills and how to talk to lots of different people, how to present. Like, there's still real value in that education. Yeah, hopefully that's.
Bear in mind as well, we have a lot of people that come to the UK for the status or perceived quality of the education, and they will naturally return to their home countries and take that with them. And we have a lot of people from here that, at least pre-Brexit, did that. And I think as long as we're sort of bearing that in mind, it would be very interesting to parse out how many of these students intended to go anyways, you know, and that's perfectly fine. As long as that's the kind of world we live in, you know, we will go and study at different places and move back. So just keeping that in mind, I think, is important.
Hi, was it James? Sorry. You made a really interesting comment about how having a more formalized status of architect would create this community of people who could then make the decisions about practice, about industry, and kind of just painted a very democratic vision of what architecture could be. And I'm not an architect, I'm just an environment enthusiast. But I'm very interested to hear each of your kind of experience outside of education. Like, in what context do you feel most, in what like moment have you felt most like part of that body of architects? Because obviously it's like another festival of architecture right now, and we're all going to like lots of talks, but it all feels to me as an outsider like it's so fragmented, and you hear lots of the same things being said and like a lot of the same visions. But I wonder, is there like a time when you feel like, apart from in your education, that you really come together and feel like a body and a community, or is that something that kind of needs to be created?
I think it's probably something that maybe doesn't exist perfectly at the moment. I think architecture is difficult because in its current state, architects are quite reclusive, either by nature or by nurture, because you're doing so much work all the time. I'd love to hear your thoughts afterwards. But I feel like because you do so much work all the time, it leaves very little time for the real senior experienced professionals in the industry to engage in these conversations. I know this is a student event, but it's really telling that a lot of the people in the room seem quite young for the normal Temple Bar crowd. And I think maybe that's an issue, that there is no time given professionally for these things to be discussed. Or maybe it's just natural, I don't know. I think it's interesting, you know, having an online community is fantastic. I think it's telling that no housing minister has ever been a qualified architect, which I think is a crazy thing to miss. So we have no professional representation outside REBRA or the ARB in government. And I think the time I've felt most connected to a wider industry, honestly, is right now. I'm in the process of building my kind of summer showcase for the LSA, or welcome to come, 20th to the 26th of June. But that's really cool because the LSA has this like practice network that we use for materials and getting things cut, getting people to come and help us with the build, getting advice on curation. Jalal raised the point about not having resources earlier, which is most of the time correct, but I think having that professional network to support a school is actually really good. And at times when it comes out, I think it's brilliant that people start to have these conversations alongside that kind of event.
Not to sound really dumb, but also I think we all really like buildings, and I think that's like a really moment of unity, this love of the city, love how it affects people. And I think sometimes we keep talking about us being a very insular and sort of reclusive industry, but if our work affects everyone's day-to-day so much, and like people do care about the spaces they live in, so I think it's worth just remembering that our work really affects people, and I think just having the skill set not to like get into the philosophy of architecture and getting too academic about it, and speaking about our spaces like a real human being to everyone around us and shouting about it, as simple and dumb as that sounds, I think helps. Yeah.
I think joining the worshipful company of chartered architects, that's a pretty good sense of community in architecture, I'm not going to lie. I mean, there's that sort of guild/apprenticeship approach. It's weird, we're sort of all hinting at the value of that, especially with advocating for apprenticeships to come back, but I think it's that early exposure to an industry just generally helps you acclimatise to it and feel connected to it. And I think there was a particular moment I had actually at the company where was this? This was like one of the spring lunches or something, I don't know. But I was talking to somebody who'd basically done the town planning for the planning and the design of the public realm just west of Old Street near the bathhouses, like 40, 50 years ago. And this is the sort of person that you would be very unlikely to meet. But they were there, and he was able to recall the entire story, all of the crazy stuff he had to deal with, what the communities around there were like at the time, and at that moment I realized, oh, this is a company or an association that's full of people with these stories that really care and were really invested about what they design. Kind of coming back to what you said, right? And I think just being proactive enough to find those spaces where you can talk to these people is something that I'm grateful enough to be able to do. Like, grateful for myself that I was like, oh, maybe I should find this. Like, you know, like we need to ask ourselves these questions, like where do the people that hang out and where do the people in my industry hang out? And just go. I think you start there and you will easily find those conversations and realise that your profession is not just you sat in isolation, and making that effort, I think, is a massive part of really any profession, actually.
Yeah, no, I think being proactive is a massive one, and you can see it now. There's so much energy with you know, even if you're not from an architecture background, people starting podcasts and all these sort of funny Instagram pages and things like that. There's an incredible energy around young architects and being proactive in the city. I think the question is whether the institutions can catch up with that energy, and I think they are doing a somewhat good job in doing that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Everyone in this room has incredible agency to do it. I think it just helps when you've got, like I said, so you've got REBA, these specific institutions that bolster that as the energy is forming. And I guess we'll see how that develops in the coming years. Is that a good closing point now?
It's a very good closing point, really optimistic. And actually on that, if anyone does want to know more either about Temple Bar or the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, do come and talk to me or to Nigel in the front here, or one of these guys, and they'd be happy to answer those questions.